over half of world trade and 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are tied to one currency, the US dollar. Oil, gold, and almost every major commodity are priced in dollars. The greenback is the backbone of the global economy. Now, imagine the unthinkable. What if the backbone snapped? What if overnight the US dollar lost its value? In other words, collapsed. It's a scenario so extreme that it sounds like fiction, yet exploring it reveals a lot about how our world really works. This is the story of what might survive when money fails, and specifically, what would happen if the US dollar, the world's reserve currency, collapsed. Currency collapse isn't just a theoretical nightmare. It has happened before, albeit on a smaller scale. In the early 1920s, Germany's Weimar Republic experienced hyperinflation so severe, cash literally became trash. Prices were doubling, sometimes within days. And by November 1923, $1 US was equal to, get this, 4.2 trillion German marks. In one famous anecdote, a wheelbarrow full of paper money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. People found creative uses for the useless notes. Children played with stacks of banknotes like toys. And some citizens papered their walls with devalued bills because wallpaper was more expensive than the actual money itself. The currency had lost all meaning, and only a complete monetary reset, introducing a new currency, restored trust. The Weimar hyperinflation taught the world how chaotic and disorienting it is when money fails at its most basic level. Now, fast forward to Zimbabwe in the 2000s for a more recent case. By 2008, Zimbabwe's government was printing money at breakneck speed to finance spending, and inflation inevitably did what we all know printing money does, which it just went absolutely wild. They even issued a $100 trillion note, a bill with literally 14 zeros on it. It sounds like a novelty, but it was a symptom of an economy in freefall. At one point, prices were doubling daily. A cup of coffee in the morning could cost twice as much by the afternoon. Eventually, the Zimbabwean dollar was abandoned entirely. In 2009, the government stopped printing its currency completely, and Zimbabweans survived by switching to anything that held value. Foreign currencies like the US dollar, the euro, or South African rand became everyday money. In effect, when their national money failed, people sought refuge in money from abroad that they still trusted. These examples are smaller economies, but they reveal a pattern. When official money dies, society scrambles to find or create something to replace it. Whether it's a new state currency, a foreign currency, or even in some cases goods like cigarettes and sugar. And while many people believe that gold will be the standard currency once the US dollar collapses, if it ever actually does, and also have this belief for some reason that in countries where the currency did collapse, that gold and silver were in fact the currency that replaced it, it's actually not true. In Venezuela, for example, they moved from the bolivar to US dollars, and occasionally other currencies from other closely related countries or nearby countries. There was only a small subsection of Venezuela that actually started trading for things in gold dust because it just happened to be a gold producing region. In Argentina in the 1990s, the currency essentially shifted to the US dollar informally for savings, real estate, and contracts. Again, another example of a country switching to another currency, not to things like gold and silver. And in Russia during the 1990s, they turned to things like bartering and IOUs and trade credit networks when rubles were eventually unavailable. So why revisit all of these cases? Well, it's because they offer a glimpse of the social and economic contortions that occur when money loses its value. If something similar happened to the US dollar, which is vastly more central to global trade and finance, the consequences, of course, would be far more explosive. But the human response might rhyme with history. In fact, it probably would. There would be improvisation, desperation, and innovation in equal measure. It wouldn't be just a straight switch to gold and silver or something like that, because, quite honestly, there isn't enough gold and silver to go around. To understand a dollar collapse scenario, we first need to appreciate how deeply entrenched the US dollar is in the world's financial architecture. Ever since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the dollar has been the de facto bedrock of international finance. Today, the dollar is often called the world's reserve currency, meaning countries hold their savings in dollars. Nearly every central bank on the planet, even those of the US's biggest enemies or competitors, let's call them, keep a hoard of US dollars, usually in the form of US Treasury bonds, as a strategic reserve for hard times. In fact, over 50% of disclosed foreign exchange reserves, and keep in mind this is the disclosed ones because there are countries that hold US currency and don't disclose it, think Saudi Arabia, which is far more than any other currency. This global trust in the dollar gives it a special status. The dollar's dominance is reinforced by several unique strengths. The United States has the largest, most diversified economy on Earth, and it has deep, liquid financial markets, which give investors confidence that the dollar will be honored and easy to trade. The US also benefits from stable institutions and the rule of law, at least for the most part, making its currency a relative safe haven. Simply because so many countries and so many people use dollars, it creates a self-perpetuating network effect, a feedback loop, so to speak. Everyone accepts dollars because everyone else accepts dollars. Even America's geopolitical power and military alliances help. Many countries trade in dollars out of convenience or alignment with the US order. The result is an entire global system built on one single currency. Commodities like oil and grain are priced in dollars worldwide. Manufacturers in Asia settle invoices in dollars. Investors from Europe to Africa buy US dollar assets when they want stability. Some countries literally peg their own currency's value to the United States dollar, effectively outsourcing their monetary stability to the Federal Reserve. A few countries have even given up and used the US dollar as their official currency. Ecuador, for example, and El Salvador are examples of nations that have completely dollarized their economies. In short, the US dollar is not just an American money. It's a kind of worldwide economic language that everybody speaks. This ubiquity means a collapse of the dollar would be a shock felt in every corner of the globe. It's like the keystone in an arch. Pull it out and the entire structure collapses. But what could possibly pull it out? How could the dollar fail given its current strengths? To answer that, we have to imagine a chain reaction of events, an extraordinary convergence of bad things that breaks the trust holding up the greenback. So let's chart a hypothetical scenario of how a US dollar collapse might unfold. Consider this a thought experiment in cause and effect, a series of dominoes that would have to fall to topple the mighty dollar. It begins with a trigger event, perhaps a combination of escalating geopolitical conflict and a major cyber attack hitting the US. And this in all likelihood would have to happen at the exact same time. Global investors who might already be on edge suddenly panic. They dump US assets, selling off treasury bond and dollar-denominated investments. This flood of dollar selling sends the currency's value into a tailspin. In currency markets, the dollar's exchange rate plunges as everyone rushes for the exits. The first effects are immediate. As the dollar's value drops steeply, the price of all things, American imports, electronics, clothes, oil, shoots up. A weaker dollar means it takes more dollars to buy the same foreign goods. So an imported $20 item might suddenly cost $40, then $60 in just a matter of weeks. Inflation explodes. Suppose inflation was already a problem. Say it was 3 or 5 or 10% a year. A dollar crash could turn that into hyperinflation, where prices rise double-digit percentages per day. And by the way, this is the distinction here. A lot of people think hyperinflation is just high inflation, but hyperinflation is when there is double-digit increases on a daily basis, not when it goes up 10-15% per year. The US Federal Reserve would likely react in panic, jacking up interest rates to try to prop up the dollar and stop the price spiral. In theory, higher interest rates make holding dollars more attractive, but in this dire scenario, it's akin to throwing a bucket of water on a raging fire. The usual tools might barely slow down the blaze. Soon, businesses in the US find they can't afford basic inputs. A factory that needs to import parts or materials can't get enough dollars because credit markets might have frozen. Or perhaps they have to pay exorbitant prices for the inputs. Many companies might start shutting down because production costs are out of control and financing is unavailable. Layoffs might skyrocket, and consumer spending might nosedive because people's money is losing value so fast. This is how a recession turns into a full-blown economic collapse. And guess what? It wouldn't just be the US that was affected because, as we talked about previously, the US is a global currency, which means almost every other country on Earth would be impacted as well. Unemployment might surge as businesses fail in waves. Tax revenue to the government might plunge because there's fewer profits and wages to tax, even as the crisis forces massive emergency spending. This leads to the next vicious turn. a debt crisis. The US government today carries a huge national debt, and it routinely borrows more and more and more. In a dollar collapse, investors, domestic and foreign, would no longer buy US bonds at low interest rates. To attract any lenders, the Treasury might have to offer extremely high yields. And that's assuming it can even borrow from other countries at all. More likely, creditors vanish due to lost confidence. The US government, unable to borrow affordably, might resort to printing even more money to pay its bills, which only feeds the inflation inferno. Fears could grow that the US might default on its debt, further destroying trust in the dollar. At this stage, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency would be in serious peril. Now the collapse spreads beyond America's borders. Foreign governments and central banks, watching the dollar's freefall, would scramble to protect themselves. Remember, many of them hold trillions in US debt and dollar reserves. In a panic, they would start dumping those reserves, trying to sell dollars before they lose even more value. And this becomes a self-fulfilling stampede. No one wants to be the last one holding a rapidly devaluing asset. Countries with currencies pegged to the dollar would be forced to break these pegs to avoid importing the hyperinflation. Their currencies could plunge in tandem with the dollar until they sever the link. The global foreign exchange system, which for decades revolved around a stable dollar, would fall into disarray. As dollars are rejected, the world would desperately seek alternative currencies for trade and savings. Perhaps the euro or the Chinese currency would rise in stature overnight, or a basket of currencies and gold could serve as a temporary proxy. But none of these alternatives can easily replace the dollar on short notice. There simply isn't another currency with the same scale and liquidity. The euro is the closest, but it has issues of its own. And China's currency is not fully convertible and carries trust issues. And subsequently, international trade might grind to a halt in the interim. Imagine oil exporters refusing dollars and importers not having enough other foreign currencies to pay. The gears of globalization would seize up almost immediately, at least for a time. Back in the US, the financial panic would translate into social turmoil. As prices soar and jobs vanish, everyday people would face extreme hardship. Savings would be wiped out by hyperinflation. Retirement accounts and 401ks would become almost worthless in real terms. People who thought they had comfortable savings would suddenly find their nest egg barely buys a week's groceries. Meanwhile, the cost of basics, food, gasoline, medicine, could be 10 or 100 times what it was just recently. We might see runs on banks as people try to pull cash, only to find it falling in value or the bank insolvent. And there could be runs on stores, as people hoard goods like they did with toilet paper during COVID. If you think empty shelves and long gas lines were bad in the past crises, a dollar collapse would amplify those by an order of magnitude. With the US economy in ruins, tax revenues would evaporate, limiting the government's ability to respond. City and state governments might go bankrupt. The federal government itself would be navigating an unprecedented emergency, potentially having to declare bank holidays or impose price controls. Desperate moves that could backfire. In such an environment, social unrest would likely break out. Historically, extreme inflation and economic breakdown breed instability. People lose faith not just in money, but in the institutions that failed to prevent the disaster. Protests, strikes, and even violence could erupt as individuals and groups compete for scarce resources. Political extremism tends to flourish in these conditions. Hyperinflation in Germany severely undermined confidence in the democratic government, laying psychological groundwork for later upheavals. In a collapsed dollar scenario, the US would face a prolonged period of chaos and adjustment. The old economic order would have broken down, and a new one would not yet be born. This is the dark climax of the collapse. The dollar essentially ceases to function as a viable currency, both at home and abroad. Society would have to find a way to trade and organize economic life without the trust of the greenback. What would daily life look like in the United States the days after the dollar dies? In many ways, it would be unrecognizable. Think about going to the grocery store for groceries. If prices inflate hourly, merchants might stop accepting dollars entirely, or they might insist on payment in something more stable. Basic necessities could become unaffordable for most people as dollar prices skyrocket out of control. In practical terms, if your salary is paid in dollars, you'd want to spend it immediately on anything tangible, because by next week it might lose most of its purchasing power. Paychecks would be spent the instant they're received, or even demanded daily instead of bi-weekly, as no one wants to hold the hot potato of a falling currency. Savings and retirement funds would be devastated. As the dollar's value evaporates, the real value of bank deposits, pensions, and investments would plummet. A lifetime of savings could be reduced to pocket change in terms of purchasing power. This loss of wealth would be psychologically shattering. It's not just numbers on a balance sheet, it's people's plans for the future, completely wiped out. The middle class would be wiped out financially, with only those who had hard assets like land, property, or physical commodities retaining some wealth. Credit would freeze up too, with interest rates spiking into double or triple digits. Loans would become nearly impossible to obtain. If you have an outstanding mortgage, what happens? Hyperinflation can actually erase fixed debts in a way, if you still have income to pay them. However, lenders would likely stop lending entirely once it was clear they'd be paid back in worthless money. So credit cards would get cut off. Banks might even close their doors to prevent withdrawals. New loans for cars, tuition, business expansion, forget it. The financial system would effectively go back to cash and carry, or even barter. In this vacuum, people would seek creative ways to carry on daily business. History gives us a guide on this. When formal money systems break down, informal ones take over. People would shift pretty much overnight to a currency which could be literally anything. Could be bullets, could be bread, could be anything, as long as other people trusted it. The key is trust. Currency is a social contract, and if the national one is broken, people will try to form a new contract, even on a small scale. Barter would also make a comeback. In any economy under stress, barter, the direct exchange of goods and services, increases when money is unstable. People might trade food for gasoline or labor for meals. Already in some crisis-hit countries, farmers swap produce with other suppliers without money exchanging hands. Barter is completely inefficient at large scale, but when currency pricing stops functioning, barter is a natural fallback for necessities. We might see informal markets where goods are priced in bags of rice, gallons of fuels, or other universals. In extreme cases, commodity money takes over. Items that everyone agrees have value can be traded. In a future dollar collapse, cigarettes, alcohol, canned foods, bullets, other portable valuables could serve as a currency on the street. It sounds dystopian, like literally everyone's living in a prison, which is kind of what it would look like. But when official money fails, people will use whatever holds value as the new money. One likely outcome is that Americans would start using other currencies for stability. It's a safe bet that if the dollar imploded, many stores and individuals would happily accept other countries' currencies. And this is what happened in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina, and so on. And in most of those cases, those countries shifted to the US dollar. In a US collapse, perhaps the reverse would happen. Foreign currencies become the refuge. We might even see a situation where multiple currencies circulate in the US. Maybe the euro for some transactions, the Chinese currency for others, and Canadian or Mexican dollars near the borders. It would be chaotic but adaptive. Each of these currencies would come with its own supply constraints and political baggage. But people will use what they can get if it holds value. Could cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin even play a role? Well, perhaps. But there are big challenges there, because crypto is digital and not widely accepted for groceries or rent or anything like that. It takes a little bit of a learning curve for somebody to be able to accept it. In a collapse, if the internet and power are still up, some tech-savvy folks might trade in crypto, but the majority, unless there was a very quick and easy learning curve, probably won't. And you have to keep in mind that cryptocurrency prices themselves are notoriously volatile and lack the stability of normal currencies. It's hard to imagine your average supermarket posting prices in Bitcoin unless things stabilize to a new normal. The government, for its part, would be trying to restore order. One path would be introducing a new US currency, perhaps a new dollar pegged to a hard asset like gold or baskets of commodities. But that's easier said than done in a meltdown, and it could take time for people to trust a new fiat from the same authorities that oversaw the old one. Another approach could be temporary capital controls. Laws requiring that certain transactions use a new script or ration coupons for essentials. None of these are attractive options, but in the throes of crisis, policymakers would be in uncharted territory, trying anything to get the economic gears turning again. Throughout all this, certain fundamentals of society would persist. Goods don't disappear just because money does. Farms still grow food, people still need clothes and homes. The real wealth, houses, cars, factories, skilled labor, would still exist, but without a reliable currency. The task would be to jerry-rig a new mechanism for exchange. Communities might band together to ensure essential goods are distributed, possibly with local leaders doing things like organizing barter fairs or using some sort of local currency. Trust would shift from impersonal national institutions to local networks and perhaps personal relationships. You might trust the farmer down the road to trade eggs for fuel, or trust a local merchant's vouchers more than a Federal Reserve note. In essence, social trust and resilience become the currency in a way. People find out quickly that they can rely on maybe your neighbors, maybe a foreign banknote, maybe a sack of rice, or some combination of all of these. A collapsing US dollar wouldn't stop at America's borders. It would unleash financial shockwaves worldwide. Consider the countries holding piles of US Treasury bonds, nations like China, Japan, or the oil-rich Gulf states. They hold these dollar assets as a store of value and to manage their own currencies. If the dollar cratered, those assets would shrink in value dramatically, delivering huge losses to central banks and sovereign wealth around the globe. For example, China holds over $1 trillion in US bonds. A dollar collapse would wreck the value of those holdings and undermine China's financial stability as well. In effect, the wealth of nations tied to the dollar would evaporate alongside American wealth. The countries that peg their currency to the dollar to stabilize their economies, take Saudi Arabia, which pegs its rial to the US dollar, or Hong Kong with its currency board. In a dollar collapse, those pegs would break under the strain. Either that or these countries would import the US hyperinflation directly. Most would choose to abandon the peg. That means an immediate devaluation or chaotic float of those currencies. That means an immediate devaluation. Global currency markets would be in turmoil as every currency tries to find new equilibrium now that the longtime anchor is gone. International trade would face a heart attack. Most trade, a large percentage of it anyways, is priced and invoiced in US dollars. If the dollar is suddenly no good, what do countries use to trade? They'd have to agree on another currency or a commodity. Perhaps they switch to euros, but then everyone would scramble for euros, spiking its value and maybe causing it to become unstable. Or maybe they used the Chinese currency, but China has capital controls and might not have enough of its own currency to circulate globally. In the short term, global commerce would come to a complete halt, or at the very least slow to a crawl, as buyers and sellers try to agree on just how to even settle the payments. Countries heavily dependent on imports, like many emerging nations that import food or fuel, could face immediate shortages because foreign suppliers may demand payment in hard assets or currencies that the countries can't get easily. On the other side, major exporters like Germany, Japan, or China would see their industry suffer as demand from the US and other dollar-based markets dries up. A worldwide recession or depression would almost be guaranteed in the wake of a dollar collapse. The initial US crash would spread through financial linkages. Countries that have strong alternative currencies, like those in the Eurozone, might see their money temporarily strengthen as investors flee the dollar into the euro or Swiss franc. But that's not necessarily a good thing because too strong of a dollar or a currency can actually hurt that country's exports as their goods become significantly more expensive because the value of their currency is higher. Additionally, Europe or China might experience asset bubbles or inflation if suddenly everyone is trying to use their currency instead. It's a bit like a game of musical chairs. If the music stops on the dollar, everyone will lunge for the remaining chairs, and those could tip over from the impact. Over time, the world would need to assemble a new financial order. Perhaps there would be an emergency summit, a new Bretton Woods, where the major economies agree to a reset. This could result in, say, a new global reserve system involving a basket of major currencies, probably not including the US dollar, or even a new international currency unit. One possible outcome is the fragmentation of the global system into a few competing spheres. Imagine a world where one block of countries uses a China-centric system, another uses a Europe-centric system, and the US itself, post-collapse, becomes more insular and has to tie its new dollar to something to regain credibility. Heck, the US might even have to ask Canada to become a new province just to piggyback on the Canadian currency. But trust once shattered might be rebuilt in smaller circles before it expands out again. All of this, of course, is speculative, but it underscores how dependent the modern world is on a single currency stability. Remove that stability, and it's not just an American problem, it's a global systemic problem. The shock could usher in a new era, perhaps ending the long reign of the dollar and forcing a multipolar currency world. That transition would be incredibly rocky, and the risk of conflict can't be ignored. Amid the wreckage of a dollar collapse, we've asked what survives. The answer is not nothing. Human societies have endured currency crashes and adapted in creative ways. Trust is one thing that survives, albeit in altered form. When trust in the dollar fails, people shift trust to something else, whether it's gold, another currency, or their local community's credit system. The basic needs of people still have to be met: food, water, energy. So those parts of the economy become even more paramount. Businesses that provide essential goods might start accepting payment in kind or foreign currency to keep going. In a way, the real economy, physical goods and services, survives. It's the financial superstructure that needs rebuilding. A carpenter or a doctor is still valuable to society even if dollars are not. They might start trading their services for tangible compensation. Social structures, families, churches, local governments often become crucial safety nets when national systems falter. During hyperinflations, barter networks and community support often prevent outright famine or total chaos. People find a way to trade and cooperate, at least at a small scale. On a larger scale, nations and alliances survive, though potentially strained. The US as a country wouldn't vanish if the dollar did, but its geopolitical influence would wane drastically. After the turmoil, some new form of money would emerge globally, because a modern economy simply can't function for long without a unit of account and medium of exchange that people have faith in. It might be an updated dollar, or it might be something fundamentally different. An international digital currency is even possible. At its core, the collapse of a currency is really the collapse of a promise. A US dollar bill is essentially an IOU from the government. It has a value because we collectively believe the US will manage its economy responsibly and honor its debts. When that belief evaporates, the money fails. What survives is whatever people decide to believe in next. It could be gold's enduring glimmer, or the strict limited quantity of Bitcoin, or the stability of another country's central bank. In any case, the interim period would be perilous, but out of it would come a new equilibrium. It's worth emphasizing that a sudden collapse of the US dollar remains highly unlikely in the near future. The scenario we've described required a perfect storm of disasters and policy failures. The dollar, for all the worry about debt and money printing, still has no true peer on the world stage. The United States has significant resources and policy tools to defend its currency if push ever came to shove. Most economists and historians would point out that reserve currency transitions, like from the British pound to the dollar in the 20th century, tend to be gradual shifts over many years, not sudden events. So don't go burying gold bars in the backyard just yet. However, exploring this doomsday scenario has value. It highlights how much of our daily life hinges on trust and intangible systems. Money feels solid. We work for it, we save for it, we spend it. But in reality, money is a shared illusion, a collective agreement. The phrase legal tender for all debts on a dollar is a promise backed by institutions and history. If that fails, we see how quickly things unravel, but also how resilient people can be in patching together new systems. The thought experiment of a dollar collapse forces us to ask, what if the bedrock of our economy turned to sand? We saw that people would still find ways to trade and meet basic needs, drawing on whatever substitutes they could. Communities might become more crucial than ever. Alternative currencies or barter might take center stage. The real assets, land, goods, knowledge, would assume their true importance when paper wealth vanishes. In a way, it's a stripping down of the economy to its fundamentals. In the end, when money fails, what survives is our ability to cooperate. It shines a light on the fact that behind every monetary system is a network of trust and a framework of laws and norms. If the dominant currency fails, those human factors don't disappear. They regroup around a new symbol of value. The world after a dollar collapse would eventually find a new balance, perhaps with multiple currencies or a reinvented financial order. Life would go on, but likely with stark lessons learned about over-reliance on one linchpin. Oh, and if you want to know what always happens right before a financial crisis, make sure you check out this video right here.